Life in the Trenches by Yun Chanji.
Shansan.
Lucas Su,
and Ryan Lee.
While life in the trenches was very harsh, trench warfare was the most prevalent technique in World War I and brought forth many innovations of war. Trench warfare is a term that cannot go unmentioned when talking about World War I. But what really were trenches, and what were the lives of soldiers in such trenches like? In World War I, trenches were dug mostly by infantry troops designed to protect the soldiers from artillery attack from the air and machine gun fire. These trenches were used by both the Allies and the Central Powers in World War I. They were mostly used on the Western Front, France, Great Britain, and later the United States. These trenches were often miles long, but they were only a few feet wide. Some trenches were very simplistic, while others had wooden supports and steps for better protection against the enemy.
Daily life in the trenches. Many troops only spent about a month in the frontline trenches. As many can assume, life was mundane and difficult for soldiers. When not in battle, they were often given basic tasks to complete in the trenches. These tasks included filling sandbags, repairing parts of the trenches, pumping out water, maintaining guns, etc. Life may have been boring in the trenches, but it is still very dangerous. Even when they were not in battle, there were still so many underlying threats that could kill the troops. Enemy snipers, artillery, stray burst shells, and raids could happen any second, requiring soldiers to be alert every time. Of course, since it was dug in the ground, the trenches were often muddy and stinky everywhere. The smell of dead, decomposing bodies, body odors, blood, pests, moldy food, and smoke lingered in every corner of the trenches. The soldiers moved around during the night to deliver supplies because the darkness provided effective cover against the enemy. The main food source for the soldiers who lived in the trenches were canned beef, corn, bread, and biscuits. Trench warfare tactics. Multiple tactics were utilized in the trenches of World War I to support military strategy. During the night, scouts would make their way to no man's land, an area between two opposing sides and their trenches, to scout out the enemy without being seen. In the top right, you can see an image of no man's land. Many trenches were equipped with listening posts to try and hear and intercept the enemy's plans. During World War I, many soldiers were given the task to infiltrate the enemy trenches, commonly called trench raiders. Trench raiders were equipped with stealthy weapons, such as handmade maces and clubs, used for short-range combat. These soldiers attacked enemy defenses, gained intelligence information, and sabotaged fortifications in the enemy trench. Trench raiders were like a special operation unit, made up of small squadrons of masked men. These hit-and-run attacks often worked because these raiders surprised the enemy, leaving them vulnerable and shocked. However, due to frequent attacks from these trench raiders, the barbed wire, invented by Joseph Giddon, was utilized in front of these trenches. These barriers could slow down the enemy from advancing and prevented enemy troops from storming across no man's land.
innovative and new weapons used in the trenches. Machine guns were first introduced in World War I and popularized because of their ability to shoot constantly at distances. It was also one of the reasons trenches were dug. Chemical weapons like mustard and tear gas were also utilized very often. They easily dispersed unprepared soldiers into a panic. An effective trench-clearing weapon was the flamethrower, because it showered flames onto soldiers in the trenches below. Grenades also cleared out trenches, because once it was thrown in an area of a trench, soldiers were busy trying to escape from the effective range. Sometimes they would climb out of the trench to escape from the grenades, allowing enemies to easily shoot them. Heavy artillery like mortars and anti-aircraft guns were first majorly used and modified in World War I. Mortars would rain explosives down onto enemy territories, while anti-aircraft guns shot and took down enemy planes. Tanks were also introduced by the British in World War I. The tanks were developed as a method to transport soldiers across a battlefield safely. Having guns mounted on the sides allowed soldiers to shoot back at others while being driven, and the treads of the tanks could easily cross 9 feet deep trenches.
Conditions of the trenches. Trench conditions were perfect for pests to exist, reproduce, and survive. Rats mostly ate scraps of food and dead bodies and used quarters that the soldiers built as their shelters. Rats would mostly crawl over asleep soldiers, sometimes biting them, making it difficult for the soldiers to rest. They would often steal food from the soldiers' pockets and the food storage areas. Rats were also found in broad daylight, but troops were prohibited from shooting at rats to not waste ammunition. However, this did not stop the soldiers from killing rats in the trenches. Troops would commonly bayonet rats and utilize creative traps to catch them. Cats and terrier dogs were also employed to help with the problem. Body lice were very common because of the filth of the trenches and the tight space of the trenches. In addition to the threat of disease from rats, the trenches held other health risks for soldiers. The trenches were often very damp because digging down often caused water to collect and gather until it was over soldiers' boots. Constant dampness could lead to a condition commonly known as trench foot, which was very similar to frostbite. A soldier's feet would get white spots and would eventually blister and rot, turning into a horrendous sight. Amputation was common for the treatment of trench foot, and if the infection spread throughout the bloodstream, it could be lethal to the soldiers. The British recorded 74,000 amputations in World War I total. Trench warfare was utilized extensively by both sides during World War I. These types of battles were a vital part of a country's defense system at the time, as they hindered the troops from advancing to their territory. Trench warfare prolonged the war because many troops from opposing sides could not really advance, since there were many different threats around them. Trench warfare also caused many casualties. Roughly 4 million people died after only 5 months of fighting the war. However, these trenches were used as trash dumps after the war. They were filled with scrap from weapons, ripped clothing, destroyed equipment, and more trash things from the war. Trenches were not utilized as much in the Second World War because countries focused more on mobility, while trenches were more of a same spot defense tactic.